to the DataStack Show. Today we're going to talk with Boris from Census, and it's categorized as a reverse ETL tool, but I have a sneaky suspicion that Kostas is going to ask about the reverse ETL terminology. But what I'm going to ask about is, what's interesting about Census, so, taking data from the warehouse and pushing it out to other tools in the stack, is that it kind of assumes that there has to be some value created in the warehouse beyond just the raw data that was loaded there, however. And so I want to know what Boris is saying as far as how does that impact the way that he thinks about customers, their product that they're building, and the ways that companies are trying to do that, right? I mean, DBT is obviously sort of a new way, but I'm really interested in that. How about you, Kostas?
Well, first of all, I have to figure out who came up with the term reverse ETL.
Ooh, yes. The etymology of tech terms is such a tasty subject.
Yeah, I mean, it's more of a marketing term probably, to be honest, but it's something that because I have also the suspicion, Census is probably the first company that was in this space. So it probably has to do with them. It's something that's related to them. So I want to learn what's the story behind it. And outside of this, I want to ask Boris and try to understand what's the difference between getting data, for example, from Marketo and pushing it into the data warehouse, and doing the inverse, which is take from the data warehouse and push it back to Marketo. Where are the different challenges there? Why they're different? Why we need different tools? And who is using? Is the user the same? Why do we have different product categories at the end? That's what I want to understand, and I hope he's the right person to have this conversation.
Well, let's go find out.
Let's do it.
Boris, welcome to the DataStack Show.
Hey, nice to be here.
All right, give us the brief background on where you came from and what you do today at Census.
Where I came from. So originally from Canada, if that's the real meat of the question.
It's mainly a geographic question.
Yeah, it's a geographic question. I'm a Canadian who lives in San Francisco through a variety of stops along the way. But my career started at Microsoft. I've always been a tool builder. So I started my career on what I consider kind of the ultimate tool, which is Visual Studio, which has, is the tool that tool builders use to make software. So it's a particularly interesting challenge to start your career in. And I spent quite a few years working on developer tools. And then about a decade ago, I started my first company that was actually in the field of what you call identity management and single sign-on for the people that kind of know these things. And that, after I sold that company, it kind of, my brain stayed tuned to what I call, these kind of data silo problems, data federation problems, and very quickly kind of re-centered on this problem that we started to solve in 2018 with Census, which was to get kind of data from product and analytics teams out into the rest of the business. We were just frustrated by the lack of bridging between those two worlds. And so that's how our company was born. And so today I'm the CEO of Census, and we're mostly based in San Francisco in the US. I think kind of a mix at this point of 50-50 kind of remote and in San Francisco, and kind of humming along.
Yeah. One quick question on the sort of the way that you notice problems around data silos and other things. Was that both in your company and with your customers, or was it primarily something you learned building the company yourself?
I guess I see it everywhere. So
once you see, you can't unsee.
yeah. I think, great startups, great founders tend to, they don't look at just, they don't look at the world, let's call it from the MBA perspective of there's a market opportunity there. They just want to build something, right?
Right.
And which I don't knock identifying market opportunities. But I find that you tend to get obsessive about trying to solve a problem, either that you've experienced or that you see and you can't unsee. In my case, it was both. So when I when I see software as a service and I see people using all the amazing apps, right? Some of our customers have like 300 apps, if you can imagine that, in their organization. I think that's wonderful, right? That means that lots of people get to use the tools that they want. People can be productive. There's, people have best of breed user interfaces and all that stuff. But invariably, and I maybe other people don't see it as immediately as I do, but I just can't not see it, is data is replicated ad hoc across all of these applications. And what is the data? Well, it's the same kinds of things over and over again. And that feels wrong to me, right? And I feel like we need to help solve that problem. And so there's all sorts of tools that have existed over the decades to try to solve what people call data integration. It's not like a new concept. And the kind of unique perspective we brought to it when we started the company in 2018 was there was this treasure trove of data in data warehouses and product analytics teams and product teams that everyone on the product and engineering side used. We all were very comfortable using those things, whether that's from your operator console or from your Amplitude analytics tool, whatever, right? Like we were all living and breathing it. And sales and marketing and success and support teams were not. And so we built this bridge, right? That went from the data warehouse out towards the business tools. And in 2018, that was a weird and novel thing. So people didn't even know what to kind of call this.
Yeah.
So how did we come up with the term reverse ETL? And
right.
Who came up with this term?
Yeah. So when we first started, this was in approximately August 2018. August, September 2018 is when we were building the first version of Census, and we're talking to our first customer. Our customers, our first 2-3 customers, basically on their own decided to describe our product as reverse Fivetran.
Okay.
If I were really specific, because they knew Fivetran.
No way, that's great.
And so they did that, right? We were just kind of like, again, you'll meet a lot of first-time founders. You're like, how do you describe your product? Is a classic conundrum, and people get too complicated. They use buzzwords. So we were just like, connects to your data warehouse, and we were keeping it real simple, and we weren't trying to complicate it with buzzwords. And then they were like, oh, so it's kind of like Fivetran in reverse, and we're like, yes, if that works for you, that's a great, let's go with that, right? Of course, we didn't put that on our website. That would seem really weird. But in colloquial speech, that's how people were reasoning about our software. And obviously, you're not going to launch your company that way. So, in our first year back in 2018, 2019, we were just going around finding our first customers, just getting them on the product, and riffing on all sorts of ways in which we could call this. And funny enough, around I'm going to say June, July, August of 2019, around there. Of 2019. One of our customers was actually working in tandem with folks at Fishtown Analytics, which is now DBT Labs.
Yep.
And they were actually, for the folks who might not know, because now it feels like ancient history, but the company that builds DBT was originally selling consulting services rather than selling the software.
Sure. Yeah.
And so one of our customers was consulting with them. So they're paying for our software, and they were developing a really cool data stack. And they were working with one of the folks at Fishtown, which we knew the company existed, but we didn't know anyone there at the time. Mm-hmm. And she was one of their true, she was their first, almost one of their first consultants. She became kind of the community manager. Her name is Claire Carroll. And she started taking notes on what things she was seeing out there when she was working with customers. And so out came, sometime in the summer of 2019, this Notion doc that was linked off of the internet somewhere, right? Which has long disappeared. In which she was kind of taking notes. It was literally a page of just notes. And in it, there was this thing going and then there's this census thing, reverse ETL, which from her perspective, it's instead of branding it reverse Fivetran reverse, it made sense to just say, oh, it's reverse ETL. So that's the first evidence of that word ever showing up in writing to my knowledge. So The reason we weren't using that term at the time was I have the unfortunate problem of being like too knowledgeable or too nerdy or too mathematically obsessed or oriented, which is like the word is technically a misnomer since ETL has no direction. So it feels weird. At least Fivetran in reverse actually was a reasonable descriptor, right?
Yeah.
But reverse ETL actually seemed like a mathematically incorrect way of describing the thing, but at least it's a generic term. So, it was kind of, we bandied around like for a while for fun in 2019. And then we launched the product and the company in 2020. And it just very quickly became the de facto name for this. And far be it for me to kind of argue with the public, right? It doesn't seem like a worthwhile way to spend my time. So that's my personal recollection of the kind of birth of that word. And then, when we did our Series A announcement, which was in February of 2021, these last couple of years are all blending together. Then the VC ecosystem landscape machinery kind of kicked into high gear.
Oh yeah.
And they, in the same way that engineers like to think about data stacks and like venture capitalists like to think in terms of data landscapes or landscapes. Everyone famously knows the marketing, landscape, and now the data landscape is just as complicated and full of logos. And so, this is like the kind of output they like to produce. This is like a success for them. It's like I've managed to put every logo I've ever heard of into a single chart with squares around them. So that's, I think, when reverse ETL really became a household concept is when it started showing up in those.
That is some high quality lore. Like even the detail of the Notion doc is it's perfect. Like it's perfect. So that's I thank you for that bit of history. Okay. Sure. My follow-up question to that, Kostas, about where the term came from is, okay, so I agree, like mathematically it's not, technically accurate. But I think even beyond that, my bigger question is, in some ways it's very singular, right? Like a line on the chart, whatever us in the data industry create or an investor creates, but you're building tooling in this space. Do you think that's a sufficient term to describe at least what you envision that you're building or like the problem you're solving?
No, I mean, you're giving me really too much rope there to say whatever I want. But
that's the point of the show.
Before this call, right? Kostas had described himself as a plumber since he had worked in pipelines for so long. And I think there's great pride to be taken in building excellent data pipelines, something that we pride ourselves on, and I'm sure you do as well. And our customers do. But it's not what I think the product is actually about. And it's not what excites our users, right? When I think of great software, especially tools, I mean, there's software of all kinds, right? But when you think of great tools, you're basically trying to make someone else, right? Your user, kind of a more awesome version of themselves, right? That's just the best way to think about it. And our users are not trying to become really good data pipeline people. That's not their goal. And when we started the company, I was not thinking, what I'd love to do is just spend my life building great data pipelines. Like that's not what the core animus was. It is absolutely an essential means to reach our end. But what I wanted to solve and what I get to see with our users every day is I wanted to bridge the gap between what I called analytics and product organizations and the go-to-market organizations. Like that, I was very frustrated, but that gap existed. And there were a lot of tools out there that had taken stabs at this, right? Famously, there were tools like Segment that connected the code that you wrote in your app directly into your marketing tools. This was a huge step forward. But I kept seeing this problem that the data organizations that were emerging, the BI organizations that were emerging, were disconnected from the rest of go-to-market, right? Finance, support, sales, like just the whole world of the company. And so that just building that connection was important to me. And you don't just have to build data pipelines to make that work, right? You have to change the relationship between those teams and the data organization. And if you ask data teams all over the world and you ask them what their day-to-day life is like, they will tell you that they're really crumbling under kind of load, like support load of getting data requests, having to solve like yet another dashboard. They're very overworked, like IT teams, right? And what I felt they needed to move towards, and what I think Census's underlying goal should be for them, is not to make pipelines that run faster than the pipelines they could write. That's a good to have, right? And I'm glad that our pipelines are superior to the ones you would build yourself. But actually to turn your data organization into we use this term a lot nowadays, right? But we really meant it from the beginning, which is like a kind of product or platform team. Because it's the only way to serve your whole company at scale. Otherwise, you're just the hated service org, right? You're the IT team that no one really likes because everyone's always stuck behind 32 requests.
Yep.
And so that was a huge kind of part of what Census has always been about and continues to be about, which is, so it's not like really about the plumbing. It's about saying, how do I turn the data team into the most essential part of your whole company that everyone else depends on? And so that's, you know, I kind of, you may have caught me saying this earlier, but I think of Census a lot more as a data federation tool rather than a data pipeline tool. That's why it's called Census, because my goal is to say at a company, there should only be one version of the truth. There should only be one census of your users, your data, et cetera. And everything else in the company should be naturally kind of a cache on that data, pulling from that information as seamlessly as possible. And that's what Census does.
Mm-hmm. Boris, can you elaborate a little bit more on how this reverse Fivetran, ETL, whatever we want to call it, right? It's actually different, and what are the challenges? That's what Fivetran does not have, right? Like
Right.
pulling the data from the apps or the database and push it into the data.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, this is a great question, and everyone, you know, from the outside of almost any company, any software, any tool, right? People always think how complicated can it be? It's reverse Fivetran, right? So as soon as you distill things into like 2 words, it's like then you somehow lose all the underlying complexity. So there's a couple really significant ways in which this is different and, you know, difficult in its own right for people to build. The first is when you're pulling data from SaaS applications into your warehouse, you're actually dealing with very consistent source data, right? So if you go to, you know, all the various ELT tools, right? They'll show you the ERD for all these applications, right? And they're fairly stable. And what you're doing is you're saying, let me get Salesforce, let me pull the schema and like dump it into the warehouse. And warehouses, to their credit, are very easy places to say, here's a table, just dump it, right? Mm-hmm. I'm not trivializing the work of building great pipelines there, but you're basically going from a kind of raw data structure that is not changing super often with read APIs off those products that are generally the first API that any SaaS product will build, down into a data warehouse, which is of a low N, right? There's only so many data warehouses that are fairly consistent at being able to write a raw table in, right? And then all the little details, of course, emerge of trying to get that just right and incremental, et cetera. When you're thinking about this in reverse, the first thing is everyone's data models are different, right? You're at the end of the data refinery. So it's not the raw data from Salesforce that's always the same schema. It's whatever entities your company has evolved, right? What your data organization thinks is essential about your users and your workspaces. And maybe you have a many-to-many model of your user base versus maybe you don't, right? Maybe it's one-to-one, or there are no organizations. It's all just B2C, right? There's all these various patterns are bespoke to your company. And Census sits at the that's where Census starts, right? It has to first take your distilled version of the data at the end of all your, you know, pipeline transformations and say, okay, we'll work with this, right? And then we have to write into applications. And there's 2 problems there. One is writing data. The APIs are terrible because most SaaS applications focus first and foremost on like easy read APIs, and the write APIs are very heterogeneous, generally very poorly designed. And then if you screw that up, the damage is really, really high.
Yeah.
So I think that is the most important aspect of this. So when you think about a product like ours, even if you were to do this yourself, right? So you're an engineer at your company and you're going to build these things, you will generally be reticent to do a lot, because your upside is like, I got the pipeline done, who gets promoted for that? And the downside is very significant, right? Because you're going to accidentally put a million things into Marketo that you weren't supposed to put in, and no one knows how to delete those things. Guess what? Deleting is hard in SaaS applications.
Yeah.
And so now your marketing team is angry. You've sent emails to the customers that are wrong. So the downsides are very high. And so a lot of what I think that's actually what generally held back this side of the company. This is why the product and analytics, like that whole world was actually evolving very well, because it's agile. But this side, it's like one project a year, one project a quarter, right?
Yep.
And so that's really what we were trying to change here. And so what do you have to do? You have to validate data more deeply. You have to do a lot more fine-grained ways of like writing data in. So we have, all sorts of different capabilities. You can use Census to say, hey, I only want to update what's there. I don't want you to create new stuff. Or, I want you to write into Salesforce, but I also don't want you to overwrite this field if it's already there. Because again, there's much more subtle stuff going on when you're in these operational workflows. Like there's an email that's going to come out automatically out of this, right? There's a salesperson who's going to make a phone call an hour later based on what's happening in there. And so we have a lot more like subtle capabilities to ensure that you're not breaking your operational world.
Yeah.
And so, one way to reframe what Census does as opposed to pipelines is actually kind of a continuous deployment tool for data. And it has all of the, the needs there that
yeah, 100%. And actually I want to extra emphasize what you are saying about like the difference between reading and writing from a SaaS application. And something that I want to add and make sure that our audience is aware of is that actually, by the way, Claire did something very right. She named it ETL and not ELT. Right. And that's yeah, but that's very, very important, because the fact that we can do ELT, which means we extract whatever we can and just load it and dub it there. And then we can have models that we version on dbt or whatever. We can go back and fix problems if we have problems. It's huge. And we don't realize that. If you go to an ETL engineer that was working, I don't know, with Oracle systems 30 years ago, they had the same problems that you had, because everything was so costly, but transformation is something that can destroy something, especially if you do it on the fly, right? So exactly as you said, it's a completely different, mathematically, it is the same thing. But in terms of the engineering that you need to put there, it's very, very different.
Yeah. And, look, I think a lot about, product as an experience as well. And if you think of the user that is trying to pull data into a warehouse, right? That the ELT scenario that we've been all kind of very familiar with for the last decade. If you think about what they're trying to accomplish, almost all of them, it's in the name, right? It's analysis. They're trying to pull data in so they can do some kind of analysis. How much money did we make? How much money could we make? It usually comes back to one of those two things. And so the use case is very there's lots of kinds of analysis, but it's analysis. Whereas in our user, analysis is not the goal. The goal is operations, right? Yeah. It's automating something. It's, hey, I want to send emails to send a promotion about a shoe that you should buy, but tied to the specific segment of users that are likely to not retain if we don't send them this shoe, et cetera, right? And so you're trying to get fine-grained detail into your email system, but not to do a spreadsheet, right? So that an email comes out, or a sales call comes out, or a better support experience comes out. That is a very different end user need. And so I think when the person wakes up in the morning and opens up our tool versus opens up an ELT product, what they're thinking about is different. Like I think they're actually just trying to solve different problems.
Quick question before Eric asks his question. Are the users different between a Fivetran user and the Census user?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you see the same thing as I do in terms of data teams range dramatically in size.
Yes.
So I admire the crap out of like a lot of our users who are, data teams of one who like, they are, three things in one body, so to speak. And so they are they pull the data in, they model the data, they push the data out, they do all of it in their own, all on their own. But I think when a data team grows, it actually ends up being different people. Yeah, because there is a user who is, you could think of it as like almost like maybe the concept. What are people getting? You remember you used to talk about the forward deployed engineer? Remember that concept?
Mm-hmm.
Was it Palantir that first started using that term? I think data teams now have all sorts of roles, right? There's the core platform building kind of people. There's ML, who, people just sitting there doing like really cool analyses that hopefully are worth the money. I don't know. And then there's this kind of forward deployed analyst, let's call it. Your job is actually not just to sit there and pontificate on what is revenue, but actually to go help the marketing team, the sales team, and the support team to improve the operational excellence of the company. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I think that person might on a different week be doing something related to Fivetran and analysis. But on a day-to-day, I think at scale, your data team, this is actually different sets of people. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Eric, all yours.
You saw me chomping at the bit. So, Boris, I'm interested in what I'll call maybe like the chicken and egg problem a little bit. And I'll lead in by, I was thinking the other day, like Google Analytics is still so pervasive, but relative to what's available now, it's so primitive in many ways. I mean, right. GA4 is a little bit better, but I was thinking about it and it's like, okay, well, part of the reason is because like you have packaged collection and visualization, and disaggregating those things creates really big challenges on both sides, right? And so like, okay, it just people kind of go to it. So you think about Fivetran and it's like, okay, well, I'm taking data with largely known schemas and dumping it into a place that can ingest known schemas, like, whatever schemas, and it's great. When you think about like the practical, I want to send emails or I want a salesperson to prioritize something, there's an assumption, I think, that there's been some sort of value created beyond the initial dump into the warehouse.
Yeah.
And I'm just interested to know, like, how do you approach that? Is because every business's data is different metrics, like, all that sort of stuff. Are you like reaching into the warehouse and trying to enable the creation of that value? I mean, tons of companies are doing it with DBT, but like in many ways, you need to have something to send that isn't there when the data arrives from Fivetran.
Yeah. No, this might be my favorite question and topic and thing to think about. You have to generate some kind of IP.
That's a way more succinct way to say it.
Yeah. And so I think if a company has two kinds of IP, like there is the widget that you make and how you sell it and market it and support it. And, all the kind of, those are both a kind of IP, right? And our industry focuses like 99% on how to make better widgets and how to the source code is your ultimate IP and all these things.
Yeah.
And I think all of this, call it, how the sausage is made, how it's sold, how it's supported, how it's marketed, is absolutely IP. And if you have none, if the way you send an email about promotions about your shopping cart can be solved by your Stripe automatic shopping cart reminder checkbox, if I don't know if they have that, but let's say they did, then great, then you don't need any of these things, right? Like you have no IP of your own, right? So I guess that puts the onus a little bit on companies actually thinking about what makes them unique. But here's this is here's what's happening and has been happening for years now. I think your point about Google Analytics being kind of all encapsulated is actually a really good metaphor for this entire modern data stack, right? We tend to think about the modern data stack as all these various tools and the phases, right? And the data comes in and then it's transformed and it's, all these things. But in a way, the modern data stack is taking every single SaaS app and putting them, making them fall on their side, right? It's like, so Google Analytics ingests data, stores data, renders, like visualizes data, allows you to query the data, reports on the data, like it models the data, right? It has everything in the app. And repeat that times thousands of applications. And so as long as everything you need can be done inside that silo, then those products are great. And what the modern data stack does in some ways is just like reinventing that. It's like, well, now we can ingest all applications into one single storage layer. Okay. And then you can store everything in one place. You can visualize it all in one way. So is that a useful architecture versus, 30 apps that each implement their own end-to-end data stack? And I think the key question there is, does your IP involve joining data? And if it doesn't, then this entire modern data stack could actually be, you could potentially throw it out, right? And be like, we have a billing system. All of our information about how much money we made is in the billing system. You can query the billing. All that matters is then the question, does the billing system give me like an interface that I can render and visualize and query? And if they don't, then of course, then you need to pull the data out so you can query it, right? But see, this is, I think, the transition. Once upon a time, people were pulling data out into their database, their data warehouse, because you couldn't query Stripe using SQL, right?
Right. Yep.
But that's going to change. All of them are going to increase how they, make their data queryable. But what you can never do is from inside Stripe or Google Analytics, join and query data, right? So that's not possible. And so that is what uniquely the data warehouse and the data stack does. So then is there insight? Is there insight for your various teams that comes from joining data together? Well, in the real world, always, right? Your sales prioritization example, or your marketing email, right? Those two examples, you could tie that to product activity. Well, that's one source of data. That's assuming your entire product is in one database, which it almost never is nowadays, right? So it could be multiple services of data. It's going to also be tied to financial information about that customer, which comes from what? Well, some kind of invoicing data, right? Which might be one billing system, might be multiple, right? It's going to be tied to their level of engagement with your team. So that might be your support data is getting joined into that as well. And that's just me kind of like rattling these along, right? I bet you the best companies have really interesting ways of modeling, their users, their customers, their value, whether that's to forecast it or to automate it or whatever. So I think the long and short of it is yes. When you use Census, the goal is not to just take something from Fivetran into your warehouse and then back out into Salesforce with no intermediate step. If then I don't know what you're doing. Then you're getting the base value, which is like, I can take something from one app and put it into another app, which is still good, right? So take like a Zendesk metric, dump it into your warehouse, and then take it from the warehouse and put it into Salesforce. Like that's still something. And I actually think it's a better architecture than connecting those apps directly, because you at least have a hub.
Yep.
But I think real value, what that person, again, if you're just setting up a pipeline that's raw to raw, then your job is not that interesting.
Yeah.
But the reason we employ data teams is that they're actually sitting there going, I think I could take these disparate pieces of information, clean them, distill them, merge them, and come up with new valuable insight.
One quick follow-up question, because I know I want to leave enough time for Kostas to ask about the term data federation, because he and I talk about that all the time, and he has some really interesting thoughts. But what are the ways that you see? I love the paradigm of IP. What are the ways that you see companies creating that? And I'll just the context behind that question is, I mean, some of the most interesting ways I see that happening is through tools like DBT, where you're sort of creating like interesting models. Of course, I think there are a lot of companies who just maybe even write SQL on the warehouse to perform the joins to create those data
Without
sets.
a doubt, tons.
What else are you seeing though? Like, how are companies creating that IP? Is there anything interesting in the way that that IP is being generated in the context of those joins?
Right. So I think it's always helpful, first of all, to step back and remember that we are very, very, very deep in the, most cutting edge, sophisticated companies.
For sure.
And to your point, Google Analytics is still so widely deployed, right?
Yeah.
And so the majority of this does not happen in DBT, does not happen in all these places. But there is business logic everywhere. There's business logic everywhere. So there's the query that you wrote ad hoc in your database. Yes, there's if we were to be really honest, probably the largest repository of these kinds of this kind of logic, this kind of query, is not in DBT and GitHub, which is, I think that's what's great there, is it's starting to become a better repository for this.
Yep.
I really hope our entire industry moves towards that model. But it's probably, and don't freak out, in Salesforce SOCL queries and Apex code.
I agree with you wholeheartedly, actually.
And I think the traditional, kind of, if we think about the sophistication stages, right, the crossing the chasms, et cetera, right? Silicon Valley and broadly speaking, software companies have moved to this new paradigm, right?
Yep.
Because their most important signals come from their software, and your CRM doesn't store that. So the data warehouse is the perfect kind of query engine and storage and computation layer for that information. The number of signals that we generate, I don't even know how many events the average, kind of software company generates now, but it's a lot, right? Like that is why we store these things there now. But if you think of non-software companies, which again, eventually everyone will be a software company, right? So
Sure.
This is why it's like we all skate to where the puck is going. But there are still furniture companies in the world, right? And you would probably find that the bulk of the intelligence, the IP that I'm talking about, lives kind of glommed onto their Salesforce instance in a collection of maybe checked in, probably not checked in code that looks like queries sometimes, like Salesforce has a query language called SOCL, or it's more imperative code like Apex. And the real goal of Census is to kind of move that into a kind of Git-backed, kind of open standard language called SQL.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's I think the journey that we're going to see over the next, but it'll take I'm talking easily a decade plus.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
People, we all in our industry, and it's why we're so exuberant and why we all raise all these capital, is we think these things happen much faster than they do. I started my first company, like I said, 10 years ago on a very simple premise that was about, if we're all going to live in SaaS, you need to have your employee identity, your password, your login, centralized and federated, right? It seems to make sense. You can't have 8,000 passwords, right? In a company. That's not that doesn't work.
Yeah.
It's been over a decade. And we're still in the infancy of that market.
Yeah.
That's how long these things take. And so I think data, we're very much in the
for sure
early stage. Yeah.
Back in when I was doing consulting, we used to joke about, companies of all types and sizes. It's okay, I've never seen a Salesforce that's not some sort of Frankenstein. And it's easy to talk down to that,
right?
Because it's actually very painful, right? It does create pain. But in reality, it's pretty advanced for a lot of the companies doing it, and enables them to accomplish things that are what else can they do? I mean, of course,
Absolutely.
The modern data stack, but it is very helpful, and it is pretty advanced to be able to customize all of this business logic inside of the tool. So that's such a helpful perspective.
Yeah. And I think there's going to be this interesting cascade, right? So I think the data community has so much still, and it's exciting, right? That's why a lot of us work in this space. And there's so much to distill from the world of engineering, of software engineering, down into, let's call it, the broader world of data. So now thank goodness, but like we're still at the early days of everyone realizing that you could treat your queries as a piece of code that can be versioned, right?
Yeah.
That's still we're still at the beginning of that, right? And then there's going to be all the other things that go around the software development lifecycle for data. And even there, we have to get quite a bit more sophisticated, right? If we're going to support these kinds of workflows. So I'll give you an example. One of the reasons because if the cascade is like software engineering, let's call it, to data organizations and then down to business organizations. So if you think of that Salesforce that you saw in your consulting days, everyone always says, you're right, it's a mess. It's a mess. It's got all sorts of stuff. There's like a field called blah, blah, blah _2, you know, it's like, there's tons of those, tons of those. But how many people in the modern data stack actually run like something equivalent to a migration when their data schemas change, right? Very few, if not none. And so we still have to, get more sophisticated in how we manage data in the core, let's call it. But as we do, I think a lot of that will then be able to have this amazing downstream effect on the rest of the business.
Yeah.
You really made me think, Boris, with the comment that you made about Salesforce and the business logic there, because you remind me of something extremely painful, which is if and how you can replicate the results of formulas on Salesforce data warehouse. So I don't know if like Fivetran is doing it today or like they figured out how to do it, but it's pretty much impossible because it's like a piece of logic there which is executed whenever you make an API call, right? And that's like, I think... That's
a beautiful microcosm, by the way, of this whole thing. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, and that's like the thing, and I think that's what justifies and makes this category of reverse ETL or whatever we want to call it like important, because at the end, you might be able to export the data from Salesforce, but the business logic is not something that you can export. Like you need someone to replicate it, which is a completely different story, right?
Exactly.
So you need to get the data out, but that's not enough. You need also whatever you are going to do with this data to push it back again, right? And these systems are like, I mean, many times I say, like, when you get like a salesperson, you can ask many things from the salesperson, but like you cannot ask them to leave the Salesforce. That's where they live. They don't want to learn about new tools. They don't care about that stuff. The only thing that they care about is their quota. And that's what they should do. Like they shouldn't care. Like why they should care about like whatever shiny technology we have.
Yep.
It's like they would be engineers if they cared about
Kostas, but there's versioning, man. It's awesome.
Yeah, sure.
You're right.
It's a pure double.
Exactly. No, absolutely. It's people. What's the term people like? People live in their pane of glass, right? And it's just like you can't get them out of there.
And I think there were like some attempts to like do that with stuff like Looker, for example. Like the previous version of like BI tools, where we're like, ask your salespeople to go and like work from within Looker, and then there will be links to go back to Salesforce. Like, no, why?
Because do you know who suffers from this the most? It's actually kind of tech founders in the Valley, because they start their company and they're like, I got Looker. My salespeople are just going to go there. And it's because like they're also deluded because they see this as easy, right? Because you and I can do it. And I'm like, no, they're not, man. They're really not. I promise you they're not. And he's like, it's easy. Like for sure they're going to do that. Like I can do it. And I was like, this is, and it sometimes takes years for them to realize like, oh yeah, I hired a VP sales. Yeah. And like they ended up doing their own thing. I'm like, they do their own thing. They do their own thing.
So great.
So I think, tech founders particularly, I think, suffer from not seeing this.
Yeah, because it's also like extremely easy to burn money. Actually, it's like one of the reasons that you exist. So why not pay 50 grand to buy like a license for these things, right? So anyway, that's another very interesting conversation that we need to do at some point. But that was like a very, very like interesting point that you made there. But I want to go, you use like the term federation. Eric mentioned that. I want to ask about that. But traditionally, and like from just like an engineer, like federation and ETL are like two completely different things.
Yes.
Actually, they're the opposite. Like when you are talking about federation, it's more about, no, I'm not going like to collect the data into one place. I'm going like to ask its data source, and then I will federate the results and present the results.
It's true.
So if this is like what you are thinking of like a solution, or unless you have like a different definition, would be more than happy to discuss about that. Where do we stand today, and where do you see going, right?
Yeah.
Like, because today, I don't know, like technically speaking, this is not federation that we have.
No. I think that's a very reasonable technical pushback. So let me start with an analogy I tend to use with my team, but it's going to make, you're going to appreciate it because I think you're close enough in age to me, but I'm starting to notice that like younger people are like, what is he talking about? So your laptop, your computer has an operating system in it. And it provides a lot of things for you, the user, and for the applications that are built on it, right? And I think that when we moved to the web, there are certain things that we kind of lost along the way. We gained a lot, so that's fine. But we lost a few things along the way. So one is login, right? So when you log into your computer, you log in once, and then like you don't open Word and go, please log in. Yeah. You don't open Photoshop or whatever and says, please log in. Please, with caveats that everyone now is a web app, so like that's different now. But let's put a pin in that. So that was, your identity, your user identity was just given as part of the operating system to all the other applications. So they just were receivers of that knowledge and just used it. And in the same way, there's a file system in your operating system, right? Your computer has a file system, and when you open a file in Word and you want to open that in Excel, like it's the same file. They don't both have to implement a file system to be able to read and write data. And so I think when we moved to the web, we lost both of these things. Yep. And funny enough, both companies I've started are solving these two things. And so when I think of data federation, the reason I use that term is I think that in order to have a wealth of SaaS applications exist, which is what I want, right? Mm-hmm. You're going to always hit this natural friction around replicating the data correctly and consistently, right? Because it's a distributed system and they all want to speak about the same things. So this is just, you're always, the more apps you have that all speak roughly about the same things, you're going to have, master data management problems. You're going to have all the things that, kind of as a distributed systems minded software engineer, you can think through, and they're hard. And it only gets worse for every N+1 application you want to use. And so I think there's only two ways in the long run that this gets resolved. One is the one I don't want, which is everything gets progressively acquired and by larger companies. Mm-hmm. And because then they can create that integration, right? They can create the tight integration between Slack and Salesforce. I'm sure they will. And Microsoft is, and maybe it's because I started my career at Microsoft that I saw this, because Microsoft is basically the best company in history at doing this. Yeah. Having built unbelievably great technology to do interoperation between its applications. They do this because they can work together and they can force Excel to do something that then Word will also abide by. And so that's one option. And we see this, right? The more we get in the later stages of SaaS, which is now year 20 of SaaS, right? Like we see these pressures. And the only alternative that I think of is that for some of these things where you need the consistency, you need to come up with a different model than just independently replicating the data in bespoke ways in every application. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I use the term data federation, because I believe that as a company, if you want to use the maximum number of SaaS applications with the most freedom and not to be tied to one vendor, you want to be able to own your data and then seamlessly have it be usable in any application. Mm-hmm. So today, my only option to be able to enable that world for people is to say, okay, what is a place? Let's work from first principles, right? Well, you need to store all the data in a way that is like the most cost-effective and scalable. Data warehouses, like it's that or S3, right? It's like either just raw storage or a data warehouse. Like those are the best tools we have from first. If something better came along, I'll take it, right? But right now, that is what's best. And then I want seamless ability to use that data from any application. If I could eliminate the data pipelines and just say, your app is built directly off the data, that'd be great. But because of the way OLAP, warehouses are designed, because of the incentive structures in the market today, you don't get that, right? So there are tools, by the way, in like Salesforce has this concept. They're the only one, but they have this concept of like external objects where you can have an external back data store, but it's slow. And then you don't get all the features and you don't get the formulas and you don't get the indexes and you don't get all the things.
Yeah.
So thus what Census does, which is we will push the data into the internal file system of each of those products, thus turning them into a kind of high performance cache on a single data store.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I mean by data federation.
Yeah, no, makes total sense. I have but it's not exactly like a product question. It's more like it's probably like it is a product question, but it has more to do with like the experience of building a product. Actually,
Sure.
So, since you first launched Census until today, what you have learned by building this product? Like,
great question. I think I would say that I've learned the most about our users, right, and data teams as a whole. And so it's been really fun to watch them on this journey over the last 3 years, just working with people. And so I've talked about this before, I think, but it really is the thing that always comes to mind, which the first experience I had when we started selling this to users was, hey, like, great, this is going to save me time, or this allows me to do the thing that I didn't know how to build. I don't know how to write this kind of connector, so it's great. I write SQL, I don't know how to write Python. It's like that was the initial kind of experience we had, and that was not surprising. That was not something I was like, what a discovery I've made. But then, and we talked a bit about this, but it became very visceral to me. After a little while of, especially in the early days, our early users using our software, but now it's become kind of, it happens more often. I started seeing a very unusual reaction from our users that actually caused me real pain. Like, I was worried. I was actually really like, are we screwing up here? This seems bad. These are bad. These are not the words you want to hear from a user, right? You want to hear excitement, power, enjoyment, right? And multiple customers started using effectively expressions of fear.
Mm-hmm.
They started like genuinely saying, I'm scared, in so many words. One customer's like, I feel like I'm holding a machine gun, like verbatim. I was like, well, that's not the feeling I want to engender in you. But, so I could have shied away from that. I could have been really freaked out, but I started to think about it. And what I realized is Census this is what I mean by it's not just a data pipeline. It's giving these users a power they've never had before.
Yeah.
Right. The power to do analysis is not new. It's massively improved with great tools. But the ability to analyze data is something they always had. Mm-hmm. But the ability to, from your vantage point on the data organization, to cause a marketing email to get sent, to cause a salesperson to wake up in the morning with a task to call this person, that did not exist before Census. Yeah. And of course, it's scary. Like, now it's your fault if something breaks. Yeah. And breaking would be ideal. Like, if Census said, "Hey, sorry, the pipeline can't go today," that's actually bad, but nowhere near the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario is you push bad data, extra data that is like going to be embarrassing when it goes out, right? And so that was the emotion that we're trying to convey to me. And so now I spend a lot of time really thinking about how can we build capability in Census that improves your confidence, right? So I think this is the point, right? Like, we have a lot of experience in the world of software on how to be agile but safe, right? code reviews, testing, unit testing, like just decades and decades of research and experience, practical experience on doing this. And so I think of Census as one of our jobs to be done, both in the software and in our marketing, in our education, in our content, right?
Yep.
Is to try to teach how to make this less scary, but also to embrace a little bit of the fear, right? Because if you, I don't want people to go back to, I'm only going to press the go button once a year because it's like, I don't want to break things.
Yeah.
And so that's probably the biggest thing I've learned is the biggest hindrance to deploying Census is actually helping people overcome this new responsibility, this fear that comes with it. And I'm like, but on the other side is so much power, so much growth, so much more your team will be able to do. And so you should embrace it. But it is genuinely scary. And so that's a first in my life to have built a product that freaks
100%.
people out.
Yeah, no. I mean, it's a good problem to have because, of course, like it's I think an indication of like the value that.
I'll give you an example in how this manifests. Speaking of product, like a very narrow, because I think this is not solved with one giant. My marketing team's going to hate me. Like one giant whiz bang feature that you can announce, right?
Yeah.
It's a collection of very like fine grained thinking, like small features here and there. And so I'll give you an example. So there are a lot of products that when you write into them, to your point about like reading and writing is very different. They have there's a term in compilers, about there's defined behavior, and then there's undefined behavior, and then there's unspecified behavior, which is actually like a different thing. Which just means like it'll work, but I can't tell you what's going to happen.
Yep.
So when you write duplicates into some systems, not all, that's the beauty of it, right? We support like 50 different applications and like they all have different, different behaviors. Some of them will behave in very unusual ways when you sync duplicates. So some of them will reject it. Some of them will just pick one and you won't know which one, right?
Yeah.
And so that is something when we built the very first version of Census all those years ago, we just said, here, let's take the table and like just efficiently, our goal was to get speed. So it was like, let's get it as efficiently as possible into the destination.
Yep.
And then we didn't know, like, oh, turns out people have plenty of duplicates. Like the warehouse is not enforcing, unique IDs. So
yep.
They're syncing duplicates. And like, we were like powering through, we're like super fast, like, yay, go sync millions of duplicates, no problem. And then you're back to the same old problem of like the sales team or the support team or the success team or the marketing team is like, this data is wrong. Screw the data team. Let's go back to doing our own thing. I don't like these guys.
Yeah.
And so now we've added the capability, like it's a built-in, right? You can't turn it off, which is we will block duplicates from being synced. Like we will block them because even there are some people who are like frustrated by this because it's like, it's errors that they're like, but it's not an error, but it was like, but we're going to treat it like an error. Cause like you're not realizing this has annoying downstream effects on your team. So it's a million things like that we've had to kind of invest in.
Yeah, I totally get that. Like, I think what people there are like two things that I think people don't realize when they start using products like Census. One is that the Census team has to learn to work with a technology that is completely opaque, right? Like you have Salesforce on the other side, and it's very interesting. I remember I was talking with one of the lead engineers in Salesforce about building Heroku Connect when they acquired Heroku.
Sure.
And the guy was like, we were building this thing, and there were like cases that we couldn't predict, even big inside Salesforce. Like there were like edge cases that we couldn't replicate by having access to the whole infrastructure and all the knowledge that like Salesforce itself has, right? So imagine now that you have Boris and his team and they try like to interoperate with Marketo. I don't know how many people have worked with Marketo, but I mean,
is there an off the record version of this podcast?
I mean, it's the best. I mean, it's the dominant marketing platform, and for a good reason, I'm sure. But like, interoperating with it is like a completely different thing. Like there are errors that are not documented. There are like behaviors that they are not documented, and they are not documented for a very good reason, because like all these APIs, they were not built like for Boris and his team to send
exactly
data, right? Like they had like a completely different specification. That's one thing that people keep to forget, I think. The other thing that they keep to forget is that as we add more and more systems into this stack or architecture or whatever, we are actually building a super complicated distributed system.
right.
And distributed systems have like some very specific rules, like, and delivery semantics are like something that it might sound like very theoretical, but it's actually very, very practical. And I don't expect anyone in sales to know that one of the ways that we can deal with that is to have at least once delivery semantics.
Right.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it doesn't work at the end like this,
Kostas,
right?
I'm getting PTSD. I remember using the word eventual consistency in front of a marketing team, and they were like, no, we need it. We can't have it be eventual. And I'm like, it has to be eventual. Like, the speed of light is not negotiable. And like, oh, that's what you mean? I'm like, because in their brain, eventual meant like it'll come up tomorrow. And I was like, wow, I forgot that this is a term that we use in distributed systems that has nowhere near the same meaning. Also, it goes both ways. Real time doesn't mean real time to a lot of people. So.
Oh, yeah.
100%.
And the reason I'm saying that is because I think there's like a very important element, and that's we are all responsible for being in this market, and that's education. Like we need to make sure that like outside of building, like actually I think that like it might sound a little bit exaggerated, but part of the product is also education, like how we can help people understand what they can do and how they can do it with their technology, because there are limits, and engineering is about trade-offs, and we have to make these trade-offs. Otherwise, like we are not going to have products that work.
Yep. No, I think I think interesting products tend to have this educational component, and I wholeheartedly agree that that's part of the journey we're all on. And especially, again, the world is large, and one of the things I have learned is the world is nowhere near as sophisticated as people think it is.
Oh yeah.
I tell people this even more, like Silicon Valley is not even as sophisticated as you think it is, right? And like we work, you and I work with some of the best, right? And it's like sometimes I'm like, wow, I remember I used to do really fancy demos in the early days. Like really, I would try to drop in words like AI to just, again, you're like, yeah, like you need all these things and da-da-da-da. And it's like, and then one day, out of expedience, I didn't have time that day, I did the dumbest version of the Census demo. Like this is back in 2018, 19. I did the dumbest, like where there was like 2 metrics you could set up in 12 seconds, like the count page views. You know what I mean? It was like count page views. And then I was like, let's just put that in Salesforce for like a customer success team to know how many times they've visited your product. Like that was it. That was the demo. And I was actually concerned, like, and embarrassed for them at first, because I was like, they were in awe. Like people were like, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. And I was like, this isn't the what? This is the basics. This is not the wow demo. This is not the wow demo. Like what? Why are you guys wowing? And it's like you forget how starved people are for this, right? And then you're right. It goes hand in hand with, then you start delivering stuff, and then we have to find a way to, we're going to have to do a book like distributed systems for regular people. Cause just because I think it's too intuitive for you and I, like we know it so well that we take it for granted. And then you end up in these weird miscommunications. And think about, I think the need to educate is doubly so, because you are right that we need to educate just to serve our own users, right? Like think of what Fishtown DBT have to do, right? To teach the concept of version control is like super valuable. Just to teach that is unbelievably valuable. And if I think about what we're doing is we're turning the data team into this kind of like company platform team. So we need to help them explain what's happening to everybody else. Otherwise they will also fail. So we have to act as like their advocates to the rest of the company. And like, that's super essential. So you're right. The education is unbelievably important.
Yep. 100%.
Yep. Hopefully these conversations help.
Oh, this is great. Boris, this has been such a fun conversation. Brooks actually let us run a little bit long, which is super fun when we get permission to do that. But we're at time here. This has been such a fun conversation, really helpful for me and I think definitely for our listeners as well. So thanks for the time. First of all, I have to say that Boris is so articulate. I find myself jealous of his ability to explain complex things and even dip into the world of, sort of formal computer science in a way that's so accessible. So, I appreciated that and learned a ton from him. My takeaway is around the way that he described sort of value that's created in the warehouse as it relates to data that's transformed, say, for downstream tools, sort of creating value with data, right? And he described that as any data that needs to be joined in order to produce some sort of valuable asset. He described that as IP, which I think is such a helpful way to frame the concept of creating whatever kind of value we're creating in the warehouse, right? Whether it's a unified customer profile or packaging some sort of analytical component from one business unit and sharing it with another. So I just really appreciated that. I think it's been helpful for me to think through that.
Yeah. Okay, it was like an amazing conversation I think we had with him in general. There are like many insights for someone to take from this conversation. What I really liked how he's using the term federation. This was like something that we discussed also during the show. Traditionally, federation has a different meaning, but it makes a lot of sense the way that he's using like the term federation, and that was like very interesting. And it was also like super interesting to discuss with him about like all the challenges around building a product like this. So hopefully we are going to have him again in the future, and we have more stuff to chat about.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thanks again for joining us on the show. Lots of great episodes coming up. So we'll catch you on the next one.